Good afternoon. My name is Barry Pavel, and I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and the Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. We're very pleased to welcome you to this event, War Stories from the Future. It's the inaugural event of our new area of work called Forward Defense. Before we begin, we just wanted to recognize this moment in the country's history. Since the tragic death of George Floyd, we Americans are certainly working through a national crisis around structural racism that is hard to put into words, but that we all hope will get us to a brighter future. We in the national security community also recognize the striking images of US military forces operating in the United States over the last few days, including in Washington, D.C. There clearly are dynamics at play regarding civil-military relations that are noteworthy. Like many national security issues, fiction, narrative, storytelling, they can all help us explore these centrally important issues for our country and hopefully help us to take the difficult but essential discussions forward so we can realize our collective national aspirations. Thank you for joining us, and now I want to introduce General Jones, the chair of the Scowcroft Center.
Thank you, Barry. Good afternoon and welcome to War Stories from the Future. I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Jim Jones. I'm the Executive Chairman Emeritus of the Atlantic Council and Chairman of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Today's event marks the official launch of our newest practice area, Forward Defense. It is the mission of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges, not only those we face today, but those of the future. And this includes challenges in the defense sphere as we have oriented our analysis over time towards navigating great power competition, disruptive military and dual-use technology, and now the defense implications of the current pandemic, all in close collaboration with allies, friends, and partners. So today we're launching our new Forward Defense practice area to further shape US and allied thinking on these issues. To formulate effective defense strategies and policies today, we need to understand where we're headed. And Forward Defense is designed to employ several traditional and innovative methodologies to help grasp the future of warfare. Narrative fiction is one such methodology. It has the unique ability to educate the responsive people and institutions to complex challenges while animating foresight into alternative military and geostrategic issues. These creative approaches to forecasting and strategic thought are most important now than ever before. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to redefine our conceptions of national security and defense, while potentially complicating our ability to respond to revisionist challenges. Therefore, in this inaugural and timely event, Forward Defense leverages its deep bench of creative talent to navigate alternative futures, to compare potential pathways towards success, and most importantly, to learn from these war stories from the future. But narrative fiction is only one of the many tools, both new and traditional, which Forward Defense employs to comprehensively address current and future defense challenges. As such, General Cartwright will guide us through the purpose, mission, pillars, and methodologies of this new practice area. So it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome our panel of distinguished speakers, including my friend and colleague and Atlantic Council Board member, General Cartwright. A fellow Marine officer, General Jim Cartwright, served our country for 40 years, and after serving as the first and only Marine Corps officer to command the U.S. Strategic Command, General Cartwright was nominated and appointed as the 8th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, second highest military officer. His 4-year tenure as Vice Chairman occurred across 2 presidential administrations and constant military operation against diverse and evolving enemies. He became widely recognized for his technical acumen, his vision of future national security concepts, and keen ability to integrate systems, organizations, and people in ways that encourage creativity and sparked innovation, especially in the areas of strategic deterrence, nuclear proliferation, missile defense, cybersecurity, and adaptive acquisition processes. I'm so pleased that General Cartwright will be introducing our new practice area to the world, and he will be followed by an engaging panel, and I'd like to welcome authors and Atlanta Council non-resident senior fellows Max Brooks and August Cole, as well as Valerie Jackson, director of the Culex Center for Innovation and Creativity at the Marine Corps University. This panel will be moderated by Steve Grunman, our senior fellow, expert and high-level convener on defense industrial issues. I'd like to thank these speakers for joining us and our audience for tuning in virtually. Briefly, before I turn it over to General Cartwright, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and off the record. Once again, thank you for being with us for War Stories from the Future. General Cartwright, over to you.
Thank you, General. Thank you, General Jones. This is a great opportunity. I think the role that I'm going to try to portray here is, what is the imperative? Why are we doing this? Who's the audience for it? And to try to give you some understanding and some flavor of the urgency and the imperative that's associated with the concept of forward defense. We have the best military in the world. Now, clearly I'm partial to that, but it is the best in the world. And we have gone through many changes in recent years to both improve our posture and our capabilities, and those changes are only accelerating now. When you look back, the introduction of precision took us, in a simple terms, from the number of times we had to go over a target to destroy it to the number of targets we could go over each pass. It was just a fundamental shift in how we do business and what we've been able to do. Then we moved into the area of survivability, and through various technical capabilities, greatly improved the likelihood of getting to the target and getting home on a regular basis at a high percentage ratio. Two fantastic capabilities that fundamentally shifted the capabilities of our military. But as we look towards the future, the challenges that we have today are often termed, as one admiral put it, I'm on the path to having only one ship in each coast, and it will be the best ship in the world. It will never be defeated, but it'll never be in the right place at the right time. It's kind of like the best surgeon in the world. And so we have been working hard to bring mass back into the equation. And as we start to do that, that is a very difficult institutional activity. Bringing unmanned vehicles, platforms into the mix to try to get us to a place where we shift and are in the process of shifting from the number of crews per platform to the number of platforms per crew, to get back to a mass capability that we have lost. This is critical to our way forward. In addition to that, we face the challenge of strategic sanctuary. If you go back in history, initially mountains that separated countries became the venue by which we protected ourselves and had strategic sanctuary. For the United States, two oceans flanking us gave us a substantial strategic sanctuary. But today, as we bring you this discussion, we're all sitting in our homes, basically as a result of a pandemic, near pandemic, intentional pandemic, natural pandemic, you pick the terms, but we are disadvantaged in a significant way. And if you add to that the capabilities that cyber brings to the table that could happen to our industrial base and our critical infrastructure, we are no longer in a we will take the fight forward construct. We will always be under attack at home. And so the concept of resilience is starting to come to the forefront. How do we build resilient defenses? How do we build resilient capabilities? Knowing that the country will experience just as much as the military attacks on our homeland, on our capabilities, on our lifestyles, etc. And so the discussion of how we start to think about those problems, how we articulate them, how we integrate them into our national security policies, norms, and regimes, all is on the table right now, and all is very, very important. As we go forward, we have these concepts that we are using in the military parlance of dominance. While I understand the construct, I worry about it because dominance leads us down a path of unaffordable. It leads us down a path of exquisite capabilities that cannot generate mass because of their cost and because of their ability to close the problem in operationally relevant times. These are difficult concepts. These are concepts that we need to start to understand the organizational imperatives and the man-machine partnering that is coming as a venue to address some of these challenges. Nowhere in the discussion right now, unfortunately, is on the education side is a exploration of decision theory or the 7 disciplines of learning and how that applies to man-machine partnering. These are all challenges that we're going to have to take on. And the Atlantic Council is well suited to take them on. When we look at operational reach in relevant times, no longer can we afford to have hundreds of thousands of troops stationed overseas, hoping that they're in the right place at the right time to use. We're going to have to find ways to do that better. Much of the work that has gone on in the space venue and in the hypersonics starts to address the problem of closing targets and operational timelines that are appropriate. But how does that fit into our strategy? How do we think about that? It's a very different concept when you sit in space and sitting still is really at Mach 25 versus trying to sit at home and figure out how you're going to get from here to the other side of the earth to address little green men crawling across a border. So these are all challenges that the Atlantic Council is well suited to take on. The industrial base is another one. We have an industrial base that is second to none, but quite frankly is platform centric. You give me a problem, wait 15 years and I'll build you a platform. And hopefully it'll be relevant for 5 to 15 to 20 years after I give it to you. It just doesn't work anymore. I mean, agile missioning is the way we're going to have to go. Missioning that occurs in hours instead of years. These are things that we're going to have to bring to the table and find a way to do. As yet, we haven't been successful. The constructs that we are focusing on, unfortunately, is how to do the same thing faster. And a general that just introduced me once told me that that's like trying to teach somebody to sleep faster. We've got to think about these things in different ways. The who in this, quite frankly, for the national security side, is the service chiefs and our allies. They are the recipients and they are the customers of the effort that we are trying to put forward. They are leading the institutional changes that will introduce things like man-machine partnering, things like mass, things like swarm technologies and new learning platforms. They need our help. They are trying to move an uphill battle to change generations of how we did it and move us to a position of advantage in a timeline that is operationally relevant. They need our help, quite frankly. You only have to pick up the paper to read to see that they are being challenged as they try to move their institutions on a regular basis, whether it is because I want to keep a legacy platform around because it was great in the last war, whether it is trying to refight World War II or the Cold War. These things are these individuals that are leading our services, that are leading our allies, need the help and need this kind of help to build a vocabulary that will allow us to move forward, find resilience, find the advantages that we need for a national security posture that gives all of us great comfort. And so to me, this is an incredibly important mission and an incredibly important effort that is being undertaken by the Atlantic Council, and one that deserves all of our attention. And I'd like to turn it over now to Steve Burnin to let him bring the panel forward and have a discussion.
Thank you very much, General Cartwright. Thank you very much. I am going to pick up this panel discussion as the panel emerges here on the screen, I hope. Right from one of the last things that you said, what could be more apropos of the conversation I'm about to lead with some artists and leaders of creative organizations than, I'm paraphrasing you here, but I think to the point, building a vocabulary of a new national security posture. Whom would the audience of forward defense, the audiences of forward defense in the military services and in among our allies, whom would they turn to build a vocabulary of a new national security posture? Well, lots, but one of the folks that we would commend to their attention are artists. And so I have three such artists, and in the case of Colonel Valerie Jackson, a leader of an organization in the Marine Corps that is about bringing creativity in the arts to bear on these problems on behalf of the Marine Corps, to discuss this. Max Brooks, August Cole, and the aforementioned Valerie Jackson. Here's what we're going to do, and it's great. We've got about an hour within which to do it. I also want to reiterate something General Jones said. This is a public, open, on the record conversation. A part of what will make it a great conversation is taking questions from those of you, and I see nearly 300 of you who are watching this or listening to this broadcast. If you'd like to get toward the end, maybe in the last 15 minutes of this conversation I'm going to have with the three panelists, we'll take questions from the audience. One of my colleagues, Clementine Starling, will curate your questions that you issue to her over the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. All right, so if you want to get a question before the panel, please write it up using that Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen, and Clem and other of our staff will curate those questions, and I will turn to Clem at about half past the hour, the next hour, and she can voice some of those questions, pose them to the panelists. Between now and then, for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to turn to each of them, each of Max, August, and Valerie, I think in that order, and start by asking them to offer some preliminary perspectives, some of their introductory perspectives of their own, and then we'll move from there to a couple of other topics in particular. Let's see where the conversation takes us. Let me start. I'll introduce you in turn. I'm going to start with you, Max, if I may. So Max Brooks is well known to many of us. He is, as it's been said, a non-resident senior fellow of the council. He perhaps is most well known for the novel World War Z, an oral history of the zombie war. He ought to be better known for Minecraft, one of the first novels of a video game, which was fantastic. And he's going to become super famous for a book that will be out in 2 weeks called Devolution, the subtitle of which I want to make sure to express here. Devolution, a first-hand account of the Rainier Sasquatch Massacre, which I think is out on the 16th of June. And I hope, Max, you will take a moment or two right here to tell us more about. But before you do, I also just want to mention, this is hardly your first, sorry for the metaphor, rodeo of this ilk. Max Brooks, those of you who don't know it, is deeply and regularly involved with the military services through the Modern War Institute at West Point, with the Marine Corps, with Colonel Jackson's enterprise at Quantico. And so this mashup of arts and creativity and the military is something that Max is rowing away at on a regular basis. Thank you very much, Max, for joining us here today. Start us off. What is your war story from the future? Or how do you want to tell war stories from the future that are going to help do the work that General Cartwright was alluding to?
Okay. First, I want to talk about the length and in comparison to those who would do us harm, because we have something called an imagination gap, the same way we had a missile gap in the 1960s. with the Soviet Union. And that goes back to the worst, most disastrous war America ever fought. It's not Vietnam, it is Desert Storm. Desert Storm was specifically fought to show the world, don't mess with us. That was a war of deterrence. It was a big set battle, and it was a full-to-gap war. And it was to tell those who would eventually confront us, don't even think about it. Because if you meet us on the battlefield, we will annihilate you. That's what we thought we were teaching the enemies of America. That's not what happened. What we taught our enemies and our future enemies and even our frenemies was that if you are going to confront America, don't go anywhere near the battlefield. Go around it, go under it, go over it. Think of creative ways to get America off the world stage, sometimes without firing a shot. And they've been doing this since the 1990s. We are a generation behind them. They have been working on cyber. They've been working on information. They've been working on economics. They have been working on ways to integrate them all into grand strategies. Right now, the ghost of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov is smiling because this teeny tiny little germ, even though it was a natural germ, has done something that his entire Soviet Navy could have never done, which was remove an American nuclear supercarrier off the high seas. And you can't tell me right now there are not people around this planet that are working on ways to do the exact same thing with other microbes. They have been working on the forces of imagination since the 1990s. We have not. We have been perfecting and growing the Desert Storm style warfare because we're comfortable with it. We know we can dominate. And we've been working on building a bigger, better Maginot Line. And look what's happening. So our military not only needs to start to think creatively, that's only half the battle. The second way is once you have these great ideas, how do you communicate them to the voters? Because they're the real boss. They elect the officials who give the money to these programs that the military needs. How do you reach through imagination and through fiction? You have to tell them a story. Because all humans have something called the ego defense mechanism. And that is a way of shielding our minds in the same way the nerves in our hands shield them from reaching into a flame. You pull back. If you scare people with too much hyperbole, if you bore them to death with a lecture, you lose them. But if you tell them a story, and if you're adept enough to shield the ego defense mechanism with a fiction, that is the psychological condom that allows people to engage. And before you know it, you have educated the public. And this is not new. This is old school. We used to be masters at this in World War II and in the Cold War. It's certainly in the early days of the Cold War. And we have utterly abandoned our ability to imagine what can happen and then how to communicate what we have imagined to the boss, the American voter and taxpayer. And we need to turn this around because our enemies, like I said, are a generation ahead of us.
Thanks, Max. Before turning to August, I want to ask you about devolution. Give us a taste of how devolution helps us to do that, helps us to expand and reclaim the uses of imagination for national security.
Yeah, if I want to educate the American people about our over-reliance on technology and our technological race to create a society based on comfort without any resilience, I could lecture to you. I could do a TED Talk where the smarty smarts all look and ooh and ah, and the rest of the people have no interest. Or I could tell you a Bigfoot story. I could tell you the story of a high-end, high-tech eco-community nestled in the Cascade Mountains as the new Levittown, with telecommuting and drones that drop off your groceries and driverless cars that come up and bring technicians to your smart homes, and it works and it's great and it allows you to live in nature until Mount Rainier erupts. And these people are trapped. And these highly educated, highly paid David Sedaris fans don't know how to change a light bulb. And they have to dig in with no tools and no skills, and winter is coming. And the volcano has also brought a pack of very hungry, very big Sasquatch creatures towards them. So on the surface, it is Ira Glass and Fran Lebowitz versus Bigfoot. But underneath it is the true, very true story of how we have engineered and are continuing to engineer a society based on technologies that make us comfortable, but have not even considered what could possibly go wrong.
Okay, excellent. We may come back to that, but for now, hold on. I'm going to turn to August. I'm going to turn to August Cole. August is also a non-resident senior fellow of the Atlanta Council, a good friend, the former director of the Scowcroft Center's project, The Art of the Future, which did a lot over the years, and brilliantly that August was directing that project to bring creativity in the arts to bear on the problems of national security. He is most well known, well, maybe most well known. I know him for lots of things, but a lot of other people know him for the book he wrote with Peter Singer, Ghost Fleet, which became practically required reading around the Pentagon and throughout the military services. Just a couple weeks ago, he and Peter have published a new book called Burnin, a novel of the real robotic revolution. And we'll want to, I'll ask you if you don't want to offer it up about the reflections or resonance of the questions about man-machine interface and some of the challenges that General Cartwright articulated that I know are in your book, August. August is a former journalist, worked at marketwatch.com and for the Wall Street Journal, where he and I first met. And I'm delighted to have you back at the Atlanta Council, August. Get us started on your war story from the future.
Thank you, Steve, and for the audience tuning in. It's nice to have a chance to connect with everyone here. You know, I have a very heavy heart today, and I've been grappling with a lot of emotions and trying to make sense of things over the last week. And I think that's actually one of the challenges that we face as we look forward. You know, when I started working on Burnin with Pete about 3 years ago, you know, we really wanted to look at this intersection of artificial intelligence and robotics, and really try to understand how this transformational wave of technology is going to affect American society. Just as with Ghost Fleet, where we wanted to really examine the assumptions about everything from the American military's over-reliance on technology to our under-assessment of the capability of China's PLA. With Burnin, we're trying to take a really hard, critical look at our society and its vulnerabilities. You know, this is something that I think speaks to the forward defense mission as well, which with foresight and narrative, one of the most important things you can do is try to confront the assumptions and biases that we have about our futures and the role that we have in them as people and with one another. You know, in the context of unpacking those assumptions, you're always trying to look for, I think, as a writer in this area, what are the most closely held beliefs and what voices aren't being heard. That leads you then to be able to shine a light on some of those areas that you're not paying attention to. Really understand the ramifications, not just in a discrete or narrow way, which is often how we do things in the policy world, but rather for their holistic impact. And being open to those kinds of explorations and where they take you to places that in fact aren't necessarily comfortable or even popular with the people who might be in your immediate community or even more broadly. And yet that is the work that I think narrative can do so well. So in a discrete sense, it could be talking about, say, our supply chain vulnerability to hardware hacking, something that Ghost Fleet did. In Burnin, it's looking at the collision of populism, extremism, and the socioeconomic gaps that are yawning and getting wider right now, in part due to coronavirus, in part due to larger trends that are currently underway from software-driven automation. And so in trying to understand all this, it's also incumbent on this sort of POV shift where you're really looking at trying to live in a future and use the sorts of senses that we experience our world all around us with, so that someone who is in fact inhabiting one of these narratives has the ability to see that future, not from their today perspective, but as if they were there. So they're thinking about, what does the street smell like? Do I smell tear gas? Am I afraid when I walk out my door to turn left? And do I know that I always need to go right? Really elemental aspects that we can either draw from in the imaginative sense or from our own experiences. And I think being able to do so is something that makes those stories feel authentic. And really, I think, continue with that legacy of storytelling being one of the most effective human technologies ever invented. And of course, there are many ways we look forward. There are many ways we communicate with our audiences and with our cohorts. Max has ably called white papers printed ambient, and as someone who writes white papers, I won't disagree. And yet we have to also, I think, you make room for, alongside this fiction or fiction intelligence approach, which is collectible, analyzable, actionable. We continue to also work in traditional means, because I think together there's sort of a fusion that gives you a much more clearer perspective on what's ahead. But this aspect of what is the war story of the future is, I think, a really important mandate to take on right now, particularly because much of what we are trying to make sense of always has to be seen in this great power conflict if we are to start from, say, where the national defense strategy begins. And I think that is something that, even as we look domestically, needs to be considered too, and understanding this message of resiliency, which is woven in through works that Max has produced, but other stories that are out there right now that I think are certainly worth spending time with.
Great, August. I'm going to do as I did with Max, and not just give you an opportunity, but compel you to talk a little bit more about Burnin. In particular, when you were listening to General Cartwright's enumeration of the ways we need to, of this vocabulary, of this imperative for a new vocabulary, what aspects, particularly of AI or the other technologies that you play out in the novel, came most especially to your mind?
One of the really core ideas in Burnin that we tried to look at from many different perspectives is built around trust. Much of the defense conversation about how we integrate with machines in our lives has to do with the conventional way of thinking about it in terms of, do you trust the data or the imagery that's being presented to you? But there's another aspect too, and I think particularly as you start to explore how these human-machine relationships evolve through ongoing use, the aspects of trust can become akin to how we view human trust relationships. And then there's also a more technical perspective too, which is, do you expect the thing that you created to work when you want it to? And yet, there's almost an existential aspect too to the powerful capabilities of some of the software, particularly those that are based off neural net systems, et cetera, that can accomplish far more analytical work than anything we could do individually as people. And knowing that those are, of course, critical not only to business, but also to security in other parts of society, we're still yet not quite finding the right ways to have a conversation about what those technologies can do in a positive sense, but where the risks lie. Because for every advance we make in a certain field, and this is something that, as Burnin follows an FBI counterterrorism agent and her robot partner to hunt for an anti-technology terrorist who's trying to turn the country against itself. For every step we make forward, we have to acknowledge the risks that go with that. And I think this aspect of could versus should has not had enough of a front burner conversation in the security community, which can be quite enamored with buzzword-rich concepts like AI, for example, which itself is sort of a vague phrase. So there's this aspect to Burnin, which is a techno thriller, but we're also really trying to help people come away smarter about concepts in artificial intelligence, concepts in robotics, and to try to walk forward many of the trend lines we see today in areas like automation, in areas like politics, in areas like the economy. So that, for example, our character's husband is an out-of-work lawyer who's lost a job due to an algorithm. We're really taking a very powerful trend that is going to impact the services side of the American economy, which is enormous. And yet we aren't really having a discussion today about how do we address that. And that can be applied throughout society in terms of understanding what is America like in a world without as much work as people will want. Again, a preview today through coronavirus for different reasons, but many of the causal forces are going to be familiar as we go out into the 2020s and into the 2030s. So we're trying to kind of serve these two goals, if you will, of having both an entertaining read, because you need someone to finish your book if you want them to come away with the point, but also being able to have them come away enriched so they can actually do something about the future that they want, not the future they want to avoid.
Super. Okay, thank you. Let me next turn to Valerie Jackson. It's been said, Valerie's the director of the Culex Center for Innovation and Creativity at Marine Corps University. She has a 24-year career in federal service, principally in the United States Marines, where she is a colonel. But before coming to the Culex Center, she was an arbitrator in Dallas, has expertise in areas of conflict management and resolution, civil military operations, international relations. She also has spent some time as an instructor at the Marine Corps Civil Military Operations School and as the senior editor and field historian for the Marine Corps History Division. Valerie, how does the Marine Corps use or have ambition to use war stories from the future to do the work, again, to get after the work that General Cartwright so eloquently commended to us?
Thanks, Steve. I'm honored to share a stage, even a virtual one, with Max and August. And the way that we're going to get after it, and I think the Culex Center is a great example of that. So I'm just going to highlight sort of who we are and how we came to be, and what we're doing, and hopefully paint a picture and provide a little glimmer of hope in these dark days that we find ourselves in.
Why not? Thank you.
Yes. So I'm your ray of sunshine. Okay, so I'm privileged to lead the Culex Center for Innovation and Creativity. It is a cross-disciplinary civilian military think tank at Marine Corps University. Our mission statement has us providing programming and unique opportunities, principally for MCU students, to help them arrive at novel solutions to current and future warfighting dilemmas. We do extensive work in and through the schools and programs at the university, but also with academia and industry, other agencies of the U.S. government, and our partners and allies. And I won't wait for you to prompt me to talk about our book and our works, and I'll talk about it now.
You're a quick learner.
It only took 2 times. Destination Unknown, which is a professional military education graphic novel, aimed at creating discussions about future war for our young service members. Volume 1 won several awards, all the way up to the Gears of Government Award. But Volume 2, and that edition was written by Marines, illustrated by Marines. It was actually something quite unique. Volume 2 is truly a joint and combined effort where we have our sister services writing alongside with us, and our Australian allies and partners too. And here it is. Here's a preview of it. Here, Destination Unknown Volume 2, due to come out hopefully by the end of the summer. And that will talk about our war stories from the future from our perspectives. So the center is both a center of innovation in how we operate, cross-disciplinary stew of ideas and opportunities, and who we are. The teamistry, I like that term, and the collective intelligence that makes our center unique. The majority of our civilian staff are actually Marine Corps University funded Donald Bren chairs, who spend their time teaching at the university, but then also promoting and extending their research, and thereby the university and Culex Center name all around the world. They do that in concert with our Director of Middle East Studies as they promote what we're doing as a university literally around the world. Most of our programming to date consists of war games, essay contests, and a lecture series. And in that lecture series, we've brought in everybody from experts that teach us how to publish our own works, to Palmer Luckey teaching us about virtual reality systems. And then lately, we had an expert talking about the intersection of Stoic philosophy and mental resiliency. And then, many more faculty development opportunities as well. We derive our inspiration from our namesake, Lieutenant General Victor Brute Krulak. Robert Coram called him a hinge of history, and he truly was. We derive our inspiration from him. We have What Would Brute Do, WWBD, over one of our doorways in the center to remind us of his legacy and of his dogged persistence in seeking change in the Marine Corps for the benefit of the Corps, but also for the benefit of the nation at many points during his long and illustrious career. And we also have the benefit of his son, our 31st Commandant, General Charles Krulak, himself a massively important innovator for the Marine Corps. He's in our corner and he's advising us. And he's very aware of what the center does and what we can do for the Corps, for the country. And he really is our biggest fan. So I'm incredibly proud of the work that the center does. Everyone understands to a person the import of what we do for the benefit of the students at the university and the ones that are scattered around the world as well, to make them better creative and critical thinkers. I'll just close by saying some may wonder, how does the Marine Corps, such a traditional and hierarchical organization, pull off a center for innovation and creativity? And I'd say the answer is actually quite simple. It's the people. Our biggest asset as a Corps is our Marines. And it was, in fact, Marine students who came up with the idea for the university's quality enhancement plan that birthed the center that I'm running today. And so, it's interesting but not surprising that it wasn't the leaders that in the Marine Corps, lamenting the lack of innovation and creativity in its ranks. It was the students themselves doing that critical self-analysis and seeing a gap and demanding, the opportunity to have more think programming and during their professional military education to make them better creative and critical thinkers. And thus the center was born. They knew they needed more than what they were getting for the 21st century battlefield. And so it is, the center came to be provided with just the right amount of top cover. Notice I didn't say micromanagement. The center's really been able to flourish. And I've been entrusted with some very incredible people, both civilian and military, to help operationalize it. And I've let them just run. And as you can see, they've done some amazing work. So with that, I'll jump off my mini soapbox and thank you again for this opportunity.
Okay, you did avoid the follow-up question I was going to impose on you by catching it at the very end, which is I wanted to have some sense of the receptivity of creativity in the arts in the Marine Corps, but you got right on that point. In fact, in general, I think August would agree. One of the things we learned, if we didn't already know it, is that there is a receptivity and quite a high quotient receptivity in the military services. These institutions regarded as small c conservative to the uses of creativity in the arts to improve thinking. There is a generally accepted appreciation, perhaps not quite in Max's terms of better imagination, but an appreciation of the fact that we got to think better, and better, quicker, faster, more innovatively in order to solve these kinds of problems. And that any tool they can get their hands on, just like any hand-to-hand combat problem, is generally welcomed in the military departments. At least that was our experience. Okay, I want to turn to a slightly different topic, but not before reminding everyone who's watching. I see a little queue of questions and answers, or questions rather, piling up there. Keep them coming. Again, we've got staff who will curate those and pick out what I hope will be maybe a half dozen to pose to the panel beginning at about 1:30. So with about 20 minutes left before that comes, I want to next turn and ask each of you to reflect upon on this moment in time. One of the things that I think artists are good at, certainly one of the things I reach for artistic treatments to serve me, is untangling complexity. In this case, maybe national security complexity, but more generally, right? There's nothing like a novel to help sort out by its end, hopefully, complexity, complex human interactions, complex organizational, institutional interactions. In our case, maybe complex international interactions. The moment we're at, as was referenced poignantly by Barry Pavel's remarks at the beginning, is a particularly complex one. It isn't too much to say. It is the overlapping within a span of just a couple of months of a 1919 pandemic with a 1933 depression, overlaid now with I hope not, frankly, but you can't help but think of 1968 in respect to the unrest that the country is experiencing right now. Hey, artists, what's the through line, to borrow a Hollywood metaphor? How can we connect those dots not just for indulgence, but to serve these problems of national security. What's the national security? Maybe that's where I'm grasping after. What's the national security problem that we can see through or within this difficult time that we are enduring right now? I'll go back to the top of our wheel here and ask Max if he could begin to answer that question for us.
Sure. I think that what an artist can provide, if they're the type of artist to do this, is the big picture thinking. And this is not just a military problem, this is a societal problem right now because we are hyper specialized. I think 100 years ago, a doctor was expected to know everything there was to know about medicine. There wasn't that much to know. Now every doctor is a specialist. How many just general practitioners are there? And I think that's in every field now. You have to be hyper specialized in order to compete. The problem is you run into stovepiping where people don't know what anybody is doing.
Let's hold on there. Max, I think you might be frozen unless it's just me. August, do you want to? I'm sorry, Max, go on. Give us your last paragraph again.
I was saying that in narration for a novelist, if we don't give our narrator an actual role, if an actual character in the book is not talking, we call it the voice of God. Because a novelist's job, if you're writing a certain type of novel, is to see the big picture and to see all the different perspectives and weave it together in a complete story. And that's something that the right type of artist, novelist, or even a filmmaker, storyteller can do, is look at all the different perspectives, bring it in and say, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. It's all connected. I think one of the best examples of that recently was Syriana, of terrorism, Middle Eastern policy, culture, money, how it all came together. And you need someone with that type of mind who is not hyper specialized to be able to do that.
August, I don't mean for you to preview your next book, but maybe I do. What is that fabric that you see in contemporary events that might help us give us some perspective about this moment in time and its significance for national security?
I think the moment that we're in is in a way, obviously a reflection of past history, but also a preview, I fear, for a very difficult decade where a lot of economic, political, social, and cultural forces are going to collide together. And the very able exploitation of division in the country, as it increasingly is adapted to the algorithm era, is going to feel more lasting and durable because of, in a sense, the effectiveness of the kinds of campaigns that can take offline or rather online life into the real world. The really challenging thing too to move it beyond just like the question of the impact of automation and robotics and other sorts of trends that we talked about in Burnin, is that as the U.S. positions itself to be a valuable ally, a reliable one, a truly strategic one, both in terms of commercial but also military relationships. The same questions that I think underpin how we relate to each other in the U.S. are going to be on display, obviously, for particularly our European allies, but also those in Asia Pacific. They're going to be a front burner issue. I mean, you're already starting to see this concern. And that if we are going to have an architecture in a world that is determined by a stable and reliable U.S., then we have to do the work to earn that. And we're currently squandering that at a time when China is investing heavily in technological and economic solutions to offer almost an alternative framework. And so the trend line, as I kind of look at these disparate elements together, the technological, the social, the cultural, the political, of course, the economic, at that last point being incredibly important. I'm quite worried, and there is a lot of I think effort that is going to need to be taken across the political spectrum to do much better than we have been right now. And the ultimate aspect of this, I think, that is critical from a narrative point of view, and as someone who spends a lot of time thinking very dystopian thoughts, but yet I think at my core, like a lot of people who write dark stuff, is a fairly optimistic person. Is that we can come through this, that we can do better because we have a choice in this. And yet a lot of the technological solutions that are being offered to us in our daily lives are more menu driven, or don't really imply that we do have a say. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, really almost at the strategic level, if we have a society that is unwilling to take control of this and have some sense of agency in how we determine our future. And that's, of course, a political question as much as it is in other areas as well. So that to me would be a really important thread to pull when thinking through the kinds of narratives and scenarios that might actually realistically describe the next decade, not in such a way rather that just validates consensus or in the DC sense, programs of record. I think that's a critical aspect of this, and that we can't allow the sorts of failures of imagination because of their strategic implications in this algorithmic driven narrative moment.
Great. Valerie, I want to pose the same question back to you. If it's helpful, is there direction coming down to the Culex Center that is asking you and the resources that you command at the Culex Center to try to thread these ostensibly disparate challenges together?
Well, and by nature, I mean, that's what we're doing. Every conversation we have experts, but the environment is one of collaboration. And so what we're finding is people are bringing their problems to us, or their questions or their ideas to us to help either facilitate, reaching like organizations or people or even disparate ones, to help them arrive at their solution. Whether it's a unit in the Marine Corps itself that is transitioning the way that it operates. Our group facilitated wargaming efforts all year long for that. FMF unit that is transitioning the basic way that it employs itself in the Indo-Pacific area, and we facilitated that, and we had all of our intellectual capital sort of focused at that one problem. And so I think what we're finding is that, we know this is a time needed for radical change. The old ways of doing business are just not cutting it anymore. And for all the talk about, who you have at the table in the room, helping you address these challenges, what we're saying, at the Culex Center is that you not only need to change the people in the room, you need to change the room. And the way you do that is to partner with people like artists, like industry, like others that are running in completely different spheres than you operate, in order to solve these very complex problems. And we've tried to do that as much as we can in everything from, how we construct a question and an essay prompt to the speakers that we bring in and expose the students to.
Sorry, made that mistake. In the roughly 10 minutes we've got left before I'm going to take some questions from the audience, I want to come back to the 4, or at least 3 of the 4 imperatives that General Cartwright's remarks drew attention to. I wrote down recreating mass. I hope he'll bear this, General Cartwright, my shorthand. Creating resilience. Reconciling the time-space compression that the 21st century is going to compel military solutions to, and then agile missioning, a concept he framed against the backdrop of needing a different industrial base. A couple of these serve themselves up very neatly for the works that you, Max, and August have recently written. So allow me again to come back to devolution or any of your other work, a lot of which bears on resilience, Max, and get your reflections on his point there that a national security strategy that no longer has both figuratively and literally these oceans of distance between us and our competitors and antagonists is going to have to be both people and forces of resilience. This is a common recurring theme of your work. I wonder if I could draw you out on that a bit. Max?
Yeah, I mean, that's the central theme. Everything I write about, it doesn't matter whether it's Minecraft or Bigfoot or zombies or World War One. It's all about people adapting. It's all about an old system, an old way of thinking, crashing into a new problem, a new world, and you have to adapt or die. So I think that that's imperative for our forces because we love technology, we worship technology in this country, but behind all the flashing lights are the people. And I want to go back to what Colonel Jackson said is it's not just about the tools you give the Marine Corps, it's the type of Marines that you have. And that's really imperative where stories come in. Because if you don't tell the type of stories about, say, the Marine Corps that include the type of Marines you want, then the people reading or watching are going to think there's no place for them. Because I can tell you as an outsider, my pop culture vision of the Marines is still Arlie Ermy from Full Metal Jacket. That's what we think of the Marines. Now, I've been lucky enough to be inside and see incredibly creative intellectuals, deep thinking intellectual people, but I don't see that in Marine stories, certainly not pop culture Marine stories. Everyone is a 7-foot tall sniper. So I think that the Corps, the military government service has to start to tell their own stories. Otherwise, you're going to get Hollywood to tell it for you. And it's going to be cheap two-dimensional stereotypes. And then you won't attract the kind of agile thinkers, the real innovators that you will need. I think that that is going to be a mission of all our forces in the next century.
Yeah, we're going to have to compete on better thinking, which, darn it, America can do if we recognize and embrace that challenge, right? August, at least two of those General Cartwright imperatives resonate for me anyway, powerfully, both against Ghost Fleet and against Burnin. What I called recreating mass, and also which you may recall he talked about in terms of transforming our thinking from number of crew per platform to number of platforms per crew. But then also the related, I think, problem of operational reach in relevant time, I think were his words. Give me a little of your reaction to those concepts as organizing principles, as I heard them from General Cartwright, for the way to think better and more productively about the future of national security.
Well, I think that the aspect of mass is still a really critical one to unpack, and yet the elements within that concept today, I think, are better understood through software, more than tonnage or fleet counts, et cetera. In that, when we're talking about the kinds of mass that is most effective in the next, say, 2 decades, it will be the network-enabled, high-volume, low-cost, attritable swarm systems, if we're talking about in the battlefield context, that are unlike anything we field today or have at scale in the acquisition pipeline. Though there are certainly efforts to do similar, conceptually, types of programs, we're still lagging. We're yet to actually implement that in a way that could have even deterrent, I think, elements be present when we have strategic perspectives on what it means to keep China, for example, away from territorial desires in Southeast China Sea. Or even in continental Europe, which I think is an incredibly challenging question in terms of thinking about the power of narrative. Can you convert that notion of mass into the digital sphere in terms of being able to create a playing field in the digital environment that allows the open messaging and exchange of ideas that we would equate with a peacetime situation to be extant during a conflict itself. So, unlike in the Pacific, for example, where you may be in an environment where satellite communication doesn't work, the usual ways that we look over the horizon aren't accessible. In Europe, you may be having a different kind of contest where the pervasive aspect of data, this idea that data is the new ammunition, may mean that you're trying to create a vision, if you will, of access to information that is not too dissimilar to what you might find, outside of a crisis. While an adversary like Russia might be certainly trying to shape that more directly. And yet, even within that construct of mass and thinking about the notion of speed, all of this is going to be happening at a pace at which it's going to be very, very difficult to have humans still in the loop quite soon. And you can see this on the software side of like cyber warfare, where the speed of response is, of course, critical. And asking permission is going to create latency that can result in defeat. The ultimate vulnerability of some of the systems that we have out there, whether it's space assets, whether it's some of our infrastructure, means that decisive things can happen in less than the time it takes for me to blink. And so I worry about our ability to understand the idea that we're actually always going to feel like we're slightly behind. And even when we are at a point where we're creating machine-driven or software-driven systems, that is going to catch us up to just a status quo or a kind of a pure aspect. That's not clear that we're really ready to kind of have that paradigm come to fruition. The final thing I'll say in that context of both speed and mass is that many of the transformational technologies that are going to reshape the commercial world will certainly change our society, which of course feeds into our volunteer force, but also have commensurate, I think, structural impacts on the way we organize our standing army and Navy and Air Force, in that you're going to be in a position where you're looking at a lot of those really hard political questions as much as operational ones about how big should the Army be? How many ships does the Navy actually need to accomplish its mission, when the necessary kind of reframing of what makes an asset at sea or under the sea truly valuable may have very little to do with the conventional contest for 355 hulls or whatever the number might be in the 2020s. And so there's a lot of cultural baggage that we have to shed to make some of these transformations complete, if we are in fact able to kind of fulfill the strategic vision that we have for our country, which is that it can still hold its own militarily anywhere in the world, and also have a very appealing and ultimately, I think, the best economic and political system to interact with if you're a friendly nation.
Well, actually, that helps me pivot to the last of those imperatives that I wanted to pose to Colonel Jackson. But I think it's a softball, Colonel Jackson, because it's agile missioning, and gosh, that's as good a label as I would be willing to put on your commandant's recent innovations as I can think of. I wonder if you could, for those in the audience who might not be fully paying attention to the practical revolution that is going on inside the Marine Corps under something like a concept of agile missioning, you might say a word or two about that.
Yes, and actually, I wanted to say a word about adapting versus agility. General Culex actually hates the word adapting. If I can quote him correctly, I'm sure he'll correct me if he hears me say this, but he prefers agility, because he said when you're adapting, you're reacting, you're in reactive mode. And we want to be, we're U.S. Marines. We need to be on our toes. We need to be agile. We need to make the enemy react to us, or our adversary react to us. So we have to be agile. So agile missioning, I like that quite a bit. The Commandant's planning guidance that he put out last summer, and that we are now in the process of going through, reshaping the Marine Corps for essentially 2030 and beyond. And what that means in its service to the nation in the joint force is quite radical. And it's a huge shift away from what the American public has known the Marine Corps to be for the last, 70 years or so. But it's exactly what's needed at this time. The environment demands us to look different, to act different, and to be a force that can respond to a multitude of threats. So, principally, while we're focused on the threats in the Indo-Pacific, as we've been told to by the National Command Authority, we have to be able to respond to threats all over. And so you have to have equipment and Marines on that equipment that can respond to a variety of threats all over the world, from the traditional missions that we have had over the past years to these new ones and these new concepts that we're training for right now, and repositioning our forces and shedding the old gear, and then starting to recruit some slightly different types of Marines potentially to be able to think creatively on their feet, and to get them the decision-making tools, if you will, wherever they are in the world, and not have to wait, for, just operating on commander's intent, not have to wait for, higher authority to make that split-second decision that really matters in this battle space.
Right. If you're going to be agile.
That's
all.
right. You got to be agile.
Okay. I don't want to crowd out some questions from the audience. My colleague Clementine Starling is going to pop up. There she is. She has been curating. Thank you, those of you in the audience who've been offering up some questions. She's curated some. Let's pitch some over to the panel. Let's see if we can get 4 or 5 of them in before a quarter of the hour.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. And hi, everyone. I'm the Deputy Director of the Council's new Forward Defence Programme. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I must say, on behalf of the FD team, it's been a really terrific conversation. And thank you to our distinguished speakers. We will continue to use narrative fiction as a core pillar of our work. So please watch out for our future events as we will continue to use this as an important area to focus on. So to audience questions, we have more than we can possibly pose to our speakers in this time. But the first, we have 2 questions about the use of history and historical analogies in fiction to unpack present-day security challenges. So the first asks, when you look at creating narrative fiction, what historical examples do you look at, both positive and negative? And then the second is from Connor Stanton, who asks, how do history and narrative inform a successful American strategy for relations with China?
So Valerie, you knew I was going to pitch this over to you, who'd worked at the Marine Corps Historical Unit. How can history be used to inform the future with creativity?
Of course, the Marine Corps in general and our curricula at Marine Corps University is quite heavily laden with history because we understand its importance to help give context to the present and to give you an idea of what the future might hold. And so it very heavily taught throughout professional military education for all Marines. And Marines are quite well versed, in our history from classes you get at boot camp or officer candidate school, all the way up through, your entire time in the Marine Corps. And so we very much believe that while history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. That's not my saying. I've quoted that, but it is absolutely true. And it can be quite instructive to look at the lessons, historical lessons that are constant themes, and to, see what the parallels in today's society and then project that into the future, to imagine, to give yourself the time to sit and imagine what that might mean, and then adjust your mission set, your forces accordingly to meet those challenges. So we find it quite instructive in what we do on a daily basis.
Max, we hardly have a conversation where you're not invoking history. You wrote an entire novel, Harlem Hellfighters, which was a terrific novel based in history. What's your response to the audience questions about uses of history?
I think history is one of the best arguments you have for circumventing the ego defense mechanism, because I think that just by nature, most human beings are scared of the unknown. And I think that when you are pitching someone an idea for the future, if you can back it up with proof from the past, and I've seen this numerous times in my work, you get a lot more traction. Every single thing I put in World War Z, you take out the zombies, everything was based on something from history, because my answer to people saying, well, that would never happen, is simply to say, it already has. It's the same in devolution. It's the same in everything, is that if you have a new idea, and if someone says, well, that would never happen, you go, well, yes, it already did in some different form. That's backing up your argument. And I can tell you, it works. It calms people down, because people think, oh, all right, if we've already been here, I'm much more willing to take that leap.
Nice. I think we may not be able to quite pull the thread unless you want to, August, on the Indo-Chinese aspect of that question. Otherwise, we'll go to the next one. August?
We can go to the next question. That's fine.
Okay. Clem, what's your next question? What's the next question from the audience?
So Kimberly Mullen says she self-describes as a security person and a fiction writer. And she says, it's not always easy, she's found, to communicate across the security and creative communities. So what tangible measures can we take to bridge that gap between those two communities and ensure that we meet the need for imagination and creative thinking?
Okay, well, August, this one does go right to you. That was the very mission, in certain respect, of the Art of the Future, this project that you ran here at the Atlantic Council. How would you respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of connective tissue already that is there between the creative community and people in government or in the military who are wrestling with questions around the future and looking right now, especially for new ways to understand what's ahead. The other aspect, and I think the Culex Center is part of this, so is the U.S. Army Mad Scientist Project. You know, there is an incredible well of creativity within the armed forces already from people who are in uniform, who have obviously a lot of creative aspects to their job, but who are writers or designers or artists. And being able to create some tribal relationships that allow you to collaborate, work together, I think is incredibly important. Because then you can access this crowdsourcing, which Steve, you've called, a technology in and of itself, which I would agree, because the monopoly on good ideas, of course, is not limited to any one person anymore, given the way we share information. And so I think that there is literally a boundless ability to have these kinds of cooperative, collaborations if you can find the right people. And that is a gradual process, to be honest. It's not quick and easy. But there are more and more opportunities to do that out there. And I encourage you to check that out.
We learned, I'm sorry, Max, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just to say that there is a tremendous amount of fascination and curiosity, certainly on the part of the American people, because there's such a divorce between the American people and those who protect them. People are hungry to understand what all this means. And we see these examples. Mr. Burnin is not going to toot his own horn, but he's currently producing a play called War Words, which is literally, it's like the vagina monologues, but for combat veterans. And it did not premiere in DC. It premiered right in Venice Beach, which you would think people would not want to see. But it was flooded with people who've never even considered national service, who are curious, who are hungry to try and understand who are these people who protect us, who are the sheepdogs. And that's just one little play as a great example from history, recent history and future, of what can you do.
Thank you, Max. Clem, another question.
Yeah, so we have an interesting question here that is asking us to really unpack the impact of COVID-19 on kind of the security challenges that each of our speakers have spoken about. Dave Majumdar asks, given the current situation with massive deficits and potential economic depression due to COVID-19, how does one convince the taxpayer to invest in the new defense concepts and weapons that we often explore in fiction? And how may all of this be impacting kind of a more forward-leaning foreign policy?
Yeah, I've had several versions of this question and conversation formulated around the scenario that now that the protection of lives and livelihoods, the object of national security once upon a time, is in our kitchens, how popularly, politically, are Americans likely to feel about the trade-off, which in the end is a resource trade-off, both in the grand sense and in the budgetary sense, between traditional objects of national security and these new imperatives of protecting lives and livelihoods that the pandemic maybe expresses most poignantly. Raise a hand if you'd like to get a start on that, one of the three of you. Max?
I mean, I'll just say that I think the onus is on those in government and their partner artists to be honest about what we really need. And I think that needs to be said, because I think you have a military industrial complex that green lights weapon systems that we do not need, that are highly expensive, that take away from other things. And I think if you're in a position to speak truth to power, certainly from art, you have to do this. And we see this now with the militarization of our police. It's absolutely wrong, but it's making people money. And I'm sorry, our police do not need armored personnel carriers and all this equipment. And I wrote an article with an active duty member of the United States Army who said, when I was in Iraq, the best counterinsurgency I did was when I was unarmed walking among the population. So I think if we are going to convince the American people what is important. And this goes back to that word that was used before, trust. Be truthful. Even if it works against your self-interest, you will earn the trust of the American voter and taxpayer. And then you can, when you do say, listen, we need you to pay for this system, this will protect you because now you trust us. That's how you do it.
Let me pick up that thesis, and this is how we will round off the conversation as we near its end. Thanks very much, Clem. And that is that trust. So how can, I'll turn first to you, August, because you invoked the uses of technology to enhance or maybe express trust from your novel, from your contemporary novel. But then more generally, and we'll round to all three of you, how can arts and creativity enhance trust? Which is maybe the very elemental thing that we're going to have to figure out in order to get after any of these harder, well, that's a hard one, but any of these other imperatives that I think have nicely framed our conversation from General Cartwright. Trust, August, how does that figure again in your book? Can technology or creativity help us attain it?
I think the key aspect, the relationship between narrative and trust, has to do with creating a connection between, in this case, a reader and a character, and understanding their world from their perspective. As such, it gives you a new view maybe on your own. And then once you've been allowed to kind of have that leap of faith, if you will, along that storyline, you're more able to better, I think, reflect on where you are in your own environment. There's another aspect too to the historical precedent that Max mentioned, and I think that is being very transparent with readers where ideas come from. We use endnotes in Burnin as we did in Ghost Fleet, because I think it's a critical way to underscore that just because we've imagined something doesn't mean that it can't come true or hasn't already happened. And that aspect, I think, allows you to further stretch the elastic when it comes to imagination, that hopefully guides people to having a better perspective on what they really want from the future.
Valerie?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I'll just bring it back around to Destination Unknown. The idea for that graphic novel came from a recently graduated student who said, we need a way to reach the majority of the Marine Corps that's 25 years old and younger, because our traditional ways of teaching them, the lessons of the past, or our core values, or to get them to think about you name it, part of the planning process. It has just old school, lecture, PowerPoint, and it just wasn't reaching them. So they said, we need a new way to have this discussion, and that's where he came up with the idea of this graphic novel. And so I think we really have to make an effort in order to build that trust, to meet people where they are, and to do so in a manner that they can relate to. So understand the society that exists right now, a very visual, a very quick. It has to be, what's in it for me? It can't be, a 15-year study, and it can't be, a major documentary film. That is not going to, reach the majority of the people that we need to convince and build this trust with in order to, to move forward as a country. And so I think really, relooking how we communicate in so many different ways is sort of a key to building this trust. You're muted, Steve.
Thank you. Max, a final word on trust or otherwise?
Yeah, I think honestly, the only way to gain trust is to be absolutely honest, even if you have to take heat, even if you have to take loss in the short term. I think you need courage. And that's there's no way around that. There's no way around being courageous with the truth, speaking it, even if it doesn't help you in the moment. If you believe in the broader mission right now, then you have to be honest about what people need, what is right, and what is truthful. And I think that cowardice, I think, is why people are losing faith in certain institutions, because they're looking out for their own self-interest instead of speaking the truth. And I'm sorry, there's no way around it. Speak truth to power, even at the expense of yourself.
Okay, Max, thank you very much. I have certainly found this to be a great hour and 15 minutes all the way around. I want to thank General Jones and General Cartwright for framing the mission of this new initiative at the Atlanta Council, Forward Defense, for us, and for framing this further discussion that we had about the uses of arts and creativity to, as I like to keep saying, I can't help it, to get after these imperatives of new national security that General Cartwright outlined, and that I think are a really good framing of the general mission of the Council's Forward Defense Initiative. Thank you, August. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Valerie. Thank those of you in the audience who have been watching. This is what we do, certainly among the things we do at the Atlanta Council, and we'll do more of this and programming that I hope you find innovative that's like this here in this Forward Defense Initiative. Thanks very much, everyone.